Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Owens, and the gentlelady from North Carolina, Mrs. Manning, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent that all members have a 5-minute legislative days to revise and extend their remarks to include extraneous material on H.R. 798 as amended. The resolution now under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I might consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I rise today in support of H.R. 798, condemning the hateful acts of anti-Semitism spreading like wildfire across American college campuses. Last year, I made my first trip with a few of my colleagues to Israel, where we were welcomed by Jewish citizens of all backgrounds, Black, European, Russian, Arabian, and Palestinian. During a visit to a Jewish family's home near the Gaza border, I held a bomb fragment that had landed in their front yard. I saw the lifestyle where the norm was always being on edge. There were bomb shelters built on both ends of elementary soccer fields and at every bus stop. One of my colleagues asked our guests, "You live so close to people who literally hate you simply because of your religion and culture. Why do you stay?" Her answer stuck with me: "Because I love my country and this is our home." None of us could have imagined a little over a year later the pure evil that would visit that home. They never knew how vulnerable they were from satanic barbarism. Those who would film, call home, and boast of the torture and death they rained down on innocent, defenseless men, women, and children. What does evil look like? The German Nazis attempted to hide their acts. These Nazis have posted their acts on social media for the world to see and to remember. A pregnant mother shot in the face, her baby cut from her womb and then beheaded. A female raped with such evil ferocity that her pelvis was broken. She was then murdered. Grandmothers, children, and babies huddled together and then burned alive. A young 20-year-old young woman shown half naked and unconscious as she was paraded through the streets of Gaza, tortured and desecrated by these cowardly devils. She was later found beheaded. Within hours, 1,400 innocent, defenseless men and women, children in their bedrooms, teenagers celebrating peace at a music festival, were murdered without mercy. And what was the response on American campuses? At Cornell University, a professor called the Hamas attacks exhilarating and energizing. At George Washington University, less than 4 miles from where I stand, students projected the phrases "from the river to the sea" and "glory to our martyrs" on the side of Gilman Library, a building named after a Jewish alumni. These phrases are explicit anti-Semitic call for violent eradication of Jews in the state of Israel. At Cooper Union, Jewish students were forced to lock themselves in the library to avoid a rabid mob chanting murder to the Jews. These hate-filled college students have no shame and no fear. Imagine accountability that they would face if they were chanting murder to the blacks or murder the trans. As this mob pounded on the front door of the building, the Jewish students were quietly ushered out the back door. This is America, 2023, not 1960. No students, regardless of race, creed, color, or religion, should ever have to use the back door of a campus library out of fear of their safety. Not now, not ever in the United States of America. I stand today to strongly condemn the pure evil of Hamas and affirm Israel as our greatest ally in the Middle East and proclaim our unwavering support as they assert their right to self-defense. With that, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 798, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of this resolution. I want to thank my colleague, Representative Burgess Owens, for sponsoring this resolution condemning support for terrorism and anti-Semitism on college campuses. Anti-Semitism is a persistent, shape-shifting hatred that is an affront to our values as Americans. It should be condemned by all. It has no place on college campuses and universities or in our society. I am committed to countering anti-Semitism in all its forms. As a co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism and as a member of the Education and the Workforce Committee. Tragically, anti-Semitism is on the rise across the United States and around the world. We have witnessed a particularly disturbing increase in anti-Semitic incidents at colleges and universities. According to the Anti-Defamation League, anti-Semitic incidents on college and university campuses increased by 40% from 2021 to 2022. Since the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel on October 7th, we have witnessed an even greater increase in incidents and threats targeting Jewish students across the country. By some accounts, a 400% increase. Students at Cooper Union were barricaded inside a library building. Shocking anti-Israel messages were projected onto a building at George Washington University. And just yesterday, a Cornell University student was arrested and charged for posting horrifying threats online, targeting Jewish students on campus, and threatening to shoot up the kosher dining hall, and calling for Jewish students to be eliminated. It is also deeply disturbing to witness student-led demonstrations and rallies excusing and glorifying the terrorism or expressly sympathizing foreign terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, groups whose driving ideology is anti-Semitic, which are dedicated to the destruction of Israel. College and university leaders have a moral responsibility to make clear that they reject hatred, violence, and anti-Semitism, to hold those responsible for these acts accountable, and to prevent a hostile and intimidating environment for Jewish students, faculty, and staff. I am grateful for the Biden administration's commitment to fully enforce federal civil rights law prohibiting anti-Semitic discrimination, and to take steps, including those outlined in the U.S. National Strategy to Counter Anti-Semitism, to combat the rise of anti-Semitism in higher education. Congress should also make clear that we condemn terrorism, anti-Semitism, and violence, and that we remain committed to protecting all students. Madam Speaker, colleges and universities are places where students learn from one another and where they decide who they want to become in life. We can respect and uphold Americans' free speech and First Amendment rights without tolerating discrimination and hate. No matter what your opinion is on foreign policy or any other issue, it does not excuse or give anyone license to engage in hate against any group. When anti-Semitism and bias against Jews takes hold on campus, it deprives students of their equal right to an education, and it harms everyone in the campus community. That is why I am proud to support this resolution condemning support for terrorism and anti-Semitism on campuses and calling for protections against hate targeting Jews, just as we should for all Americans of any background who are facing increased threats. I encourage all my colleagues to support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2.5 minutes to Chairwoman from North Carolina, Dr. Fox.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I thank my colleague for yielding. I rise today in support of H.Res. 798, a resolution condemning anti-Semitism on college campuses and encouraging campus leaders to speak out in support of their Jewish students, faculty, and guests. One word that comes to mind is regression. The extreme rhetoric on college campuses is, sadly, yet another chapter in the troubled history between Jewish students and American universities. It started with quotas. In 1922, Harvard President Abbott Lowell proposed a cap on the number of Jewish enrollees each year. Many other universities adopted similar policies. Out of Jewish quotas, alternative Jewish education opportunities were born. In 1948, Brandeis University was founded. It was named after Lowell's great enemy, the first Jewish Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis. The initial 107 student class at Brandeis was overwhelmingly Jewish and just 12 miles down the road from Cambridge. It stood as a stark reminder of ethnic discrimination. The world progressed greatly in the post-war period, but the events of the past month have ripped open a wound in American post-secondary education that had been festering. There's no better example than modern Harvard. The Coalition Student Group letter from Harvard was the first anti-Semitic demonstration on campus to make the news after Hamas's October 7 attack, hearkening back to Harvard's Jewish quotas. Harvard is a bellwether, for better or for worse. Res. 798 condemns the support of terrorists and condemns anti-Semitic behavior. I thank Representative Owens for putting this important resolution forward, and I pray that it's a step towards reversing the abhorrent behavior that has taken over college campuses. We must throw anti-Semitism into the dustbin of history where it belongs. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Michigan, Dr. Tim Walbert.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong support of Res. 798. On October 7th, Hamas carried out the largest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Women were brutally raped and murdered. Babies brutally murdered and decapitated. Innocent civilians abducted, tortured, and murdered. In the aftermath of, we've seen despicable acts of anti-Semitism and support for the terrorists across college campuses in this country. Students organizing protests calling for, quote, armed confrontation with oppressors, and using imagery reflecting the Hamas terrorists paragliding into the music festival in Israel. Vile chants calling for the elimination of Jewish people and the state of Israel. Professors asking Jewish students to identify themselves and stand in the corner of a classroom, and projections onto the campus building saying, glory to our martyrs, referring to the Hamas terrorists. These are despicable actions, and they've created a hostile environment for many Jewish students across our country. This is wholly unacceptable and not free speech. Jewish students deserve to know they are safe on campus, and colleges and universities have a legal and moral obligation to foster an environment free from vile anti-Semitic discrimination. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I reserve.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from North Carolina reserves.
Okay. Madam Speaker, I would like to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Rick Allen.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Utah. And Madam Speaker, I rise today as co-sponsor of Res. 798, a resolution that demands Congress take immediate attention and action in condemning the recent surge of support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist organizations at American universities. Let's be clear. The targets of Hamas on October 7th were not Israeli military installations. The targets were innocent men, women, and children. It was demonic and barbaric. What are we seeing on our college campuses? This is just not a cause for concern. It's an outrageous affront to the principles of peace, tolerance, and safety that our educational institutions espouse. From the explicit endorsements of violence to the vile targeting of Jewish students, we are witnessing a blatant disregard for the well-being and security of young people. This is not a matter of political correctness. It's a matter of ensuring the safety and dignity of every individual on our college campuses. The incidents outlined in this resolution are occurring across the nation and threaten the very fabric of our educational institutions. From student organizations calling on fellow students to demonstrate with armed confrontation, to school administrators failing to clearly speak out. It's time to take a stand to safeguard the well-being of our students and to uphold the principles that our nation was founded on and holds dear. Could I have 30 more seconds?
30 seconds.
Thank you.
I implore my colleagues to join me in supporting HRES 798. We must send a resounding message that we will not tolerate the spread of hatred within the halls of our universities. And with that, I yield back.
Madam Speaker, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bob Good.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of my friend from Utah's resolution that denounces terrorism and anti-Semitism at universities across this country. The world watched in horror on October 7 when Hamas launched their unprovoked and brutal terrorist attack on Israel, causing the greatest single-day loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. I joined the overwhelming majority of Americans in immediately expressing unwavering support for Israel, but sadly, we've also seen an outbreak of support for the perpetrators of terror, Hamas and Hezbollah, on our college campuses. What are we teaching college students on these campuses? What kind of professors are doing this teaching? In my own district, the Students for Justice in Palestine at the University of Virginia issued a statement that the violence against Israel makes them hopeful for the future of Palestine, implying that Israel was somehow deserving of the atrocities committed against them. Free speech is protected in this country, but it cannot be used to support terrorist actions. To the University of Virginia's credit, the president issued a statement clearly condemning Hamas, but many other university administrators were not as definitive in their responses. But this resolution challenges college administrators to condemn anti-Semitism and focus on education rather than liberal indoctrination. I'm proud to sponsor this resolution, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield a minute and a half to the gentlewoman from Indiana.
Actually, I think the gentleman suspends.
Okay.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves.
Okay.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Indiana, Representative Aaron Hutchins.
The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. With regard to Israel, the mask has finally come off the woke left, whose center of gravity, sadly, is situated in American universities. Following the barbaric attacks on Israel by Hamas, student groups at universities across the country demonstrated support for the terrorists. Let me pause to say that again. Demonstrations are happening at universities across the United States in support of terrorists. A student group at my alma mater, the George Washington University, called for the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people. The liberal ideology is emanating from our universities and spreading throughout our corporations and tainting the worldview of the next generation of Americans. This is dangerous and must be rejected. That's why I'm an original sponsor of Representative Owens' resolution condemning the support of terrorists at our institutions of higher education. I urge all Americans to join me and my colleagues in stating in no uncertain terms that we support our Jewish students and affirm the statehood of Israel and the right of her people to live and to thrive. I urge my colleagues to support HRES 739, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, my friend. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Representative Kevin Kirby. Kylie.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Earlier this year, I drafted a resolution condemning anti-Semitism on our college campuses. There had been a deeply disturbing rise in anti-Semitic incidents on campuses in California and across the country, and also a totally inadequate response by university faculty and administration, who were unable or unwilling to condemn this activity, and sometimes it happened with their tacit or even outright support of individual faculty members. This has been a growing problem on university campuses. Just a few years ago, a task force of faculty, university faculty in California, was tasked with preparing an ethnic studies curriculum for high schools. What they produced was a deeply anti-Semitic document that Gavin Newsom condemned, saying that it was offensive in so many ways and would never see the light of day, and that the California Legislative Jewish Caucus said echoed the propaganda of the Nazi regime. But in spite of all of this, nothing could have prepared us for what has happened in the aftermath of Hamas's terrorist attack on the state of Israel. Nothing could have prepared us for the failure of moral leadership, where you have university faculty and administration, which have been all too willing to wade into every political controversy of the day with clearly defined views, have been unable to render the most straightforward of moral judgments, to condemn in clear language an assault, an attack on innocent men, women, children, and babies, an attack on Israel's very right to exist. And many student groups taking their cue have now targeted Jewish students, and Jewish students are feeling unsafe on our campuses. Larry Summers, who is the former president of Harvard and a high-ranking Obama official, said this on October 9th. In my nearly 50 years of Harvard affiliation, I have never been as disillusioned and alienated as I am today. The silence from Harvard's leadership so far, coupled with a vocal and widely reported student group statement blaming Israel solely, has allowed Harvard to appear at best neutral towards active terror against the Jewish state of Israel. Instead, Harvard is being defined by the morally unconscionable statement apparently coming from 24 student groups blaming all the violence on Israel. I am sickened, he said. So today's resolution, which is joining mine with one offered by Representative Owens, is providing the moral leadership that many of our universities have failed to provide. It condemns the support of Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist organizations at institutions of higher education, which may lead to the creation of a hostile environment for Jewish students, faculty, and staff. It calls on campus administrators to condemn all forms of anti-Semitism on college campuses and to ensure Jewish faculty, students, and guests can exercise the same free speech rights as are guaranteed to all other faculty, students, and guests without intimidation. Madam Speaker, it is vitally important that this resolution pass and that it do so with strong bipartisan support. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I acknowledge that my colleague is standing against anti-Semitism and that he introduced a measure to require the teaching of the Holocaust. I also introduced an amendment at that same hearing. My amendment would have prohibited the banning by schools and school districts of books about the Holocaust, because school districts across the country are banning books like The Diary of Anne Frank and the award-winning graphic novel Mouse, because they find those books too disturbing. This is exactly what we should be talking about in our hearings, that we should be teaching students the history of the Holocaust using award-winning books, because these are perfect vehicles for making sure that students understand what has happened when anti-Semitism has been allowed to go unchallenged. I thank my colleague for raising this issue in today's setting and hope he will continue to support efforts to avoid the banning of books on the Holocaust. And I reserve.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my gentleman from Florida, Mr. Aaron Bean.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Speaker, as you know, the Holocaust ended in 1945, but tragically, the hatred behind it has not. We are all horrified by the surge in violent anti-Semitism taking place across America. Today, we're seeing the full force of Jewish contempt on our college and university campuses, and it has never been more hateful. Harassed, threatened, violently targeted just for being Jewish in 2023. It's unthinkable that students are unable to walk between classes to their dorms or the dining hall, but it's the reality for Jewish students on campus today. The history of the Holocaust warns us what can happen when hatred is met by silence. We cannot stand by while Jewish students feel threatened. It's more than a discussion, it's a call to action. Madam Speaker, today I stand before you to condemn these dangerous acts of anti-Semitism, and that's why I urge everybody to support Representative Owens and his resolution to condemn support for terrorist organizations on campuses across the nation. Anti-Semitism is not activism. It is hatred, pure and simple, and it has no place in America today. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it. I reserve the right to close.
Okay. The gentleman is reserved and is ready to close. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
I'm prepared to close.
Wonderful. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing. For the past 2 weeks, I have been inundated with phone calls, emails, and texts from frantic parents and terrified students who have experienced online hate, taunting from their fellow students, exposure to swastikas on their dorm walls and doors, chants of death to Israel and Jews, seeing those words chalked on campus walkways, students who have sat through anti-Israel and anti-Semitic rants by professors who were supposed to be teaching them, not spreading anti-Israel propaganda. Rallies by students and others who are ignorant about the history of the Middle East and ignorant about the 2,000-year history of anti-Semitism. Our education system is failing us, and we are seeing it come alive on our college campuses. And we are seeing that failure at some of the most illustrious institutions in my state of North Carolina and at my own alma mater in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We are seeing the failure of university presidents and university chancellors being able to take the simple step of condemning terrorism against Israel, of condemning the gruesome attack by Hamas on innocent Israeli civilians and the taking of hostages, and the inability to simply call out and condemn anti-Semitism. And they do this under the guise of free speech. Madam Speaker, I am glad that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle are committed to standing strong against terrorism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of hate on college campuses. This is critical. This is an important and timely resolution that seeks to call out a deeply disturbing pattern of support for terrorism and anti-Semitism that we have been seeing on all too many college campuses in recent weeks. I am appalled by the inability of our institutions of higher education to be able to stand up for what is right and to take on the initiative to use these incidents as a teaching opportunity. After all, what are our colleges and universities for if they are unable to use this opportunity to teach about what is right and what is accurate? I ask all my colleagues to join me in voting in support of this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina yields. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In concluding this discussion, I have 5 words for American colleges. You reap what you sow. After failing miserably to condemn student support for terrorism on your campuses, Jewish students are now living in fear. The vile anti-Semitic protests of your students educated on your campuses have brought to light what for decades have thrived in the dark. Many American universities are fundamentally adrift. Instead of an environment of enlightenment and one that unites diverse ideas, they have become incubators of hate. They call for inclusion, yet exclude the Jewish people. They call for neutrality, yet stoke the flames of cultural wars that have brought us here. Deep in humanity's department, seeds of bigotry have taken root. The poison fruits of a sanctioned ideology are now ripe for all to see. At the Committee of Education Workforce, we will call out rotten ideologies where we find them. At this moment, though, we must offer the clearest terms the condemnation of Hamas, brutality, and violence. Now is the time for Congress to shine as an example of moral clarity, both at home and abroad. With that, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 798 and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman.